High above the frozen curve of the earth, 8 engines tremble against the dark. Inside the metal skin of a massive aircraft, men sit in silence, listening to the hum of power and the steady pulse of instruments. Somewhere far below, cities sleep unaware that a single coded message could change the fate of the world before dawn. For decades, peace did not rest on treaties alone. It rested on vigilance, endurance, and a machine designed to fly farther, carry heavier burdens, and wait longer than any bomber before it. This was an era when hesitation meant annihilation, and readiness meant survival. The Cold War did not roar, it whispered, relentlessly, through radar screens and alert klaxons. The aircraft at the center of this uneasy balance was more than steel and fuel. It was a signal. When American presidents needed to demonstrate resolve without words, this machine spoke for them slowly, unmistakably, and with terrifying clarity. Its presence alone was meant to stop wars before they began, but behind that power were human beings, pilots who waited through sleepless nights, crews who trained for missions they prayed would never come, and families who lived with the knowledge that deterrence carried a terrible price. How did one aircraft come to embody both global stability and the constant shadow of catastrophe? To understand that question, we must return to a world just emerging from the ashes of the Second World War. Long before intercontinental missiles and satellite surveillance, war from the air was already reshaping human conflict. During the First World War, crude aircraft proved that explosives could be delivered beyond the front lines. By the Second World War, bombing had evolved into an industrial enterprise. Entire cities were placed in the crosshairs of strategy, and air power became a tool not just to defeat armies, but to break nations. In Europe, waves of British Lancaster bombers crossed the night sky. In the Pacific, American B-29 seconds carried the war to Japan itself. Then, in August 1945, 2 bombs fell that changed the meaning of warfare forever. Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the arrival of nuclear weapons, instruments so destructive that victory and annihilation suddenly became dangerously close concepts. When the guns fell silent later that year, peace returned, but it was uneasy and incomplete. The former wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly hardened into suspicion. By the late 1940s, both sides understood that the next war, if it came, would not be fought with conventional armies alone. It would be decided by who could strike first, farthest, and with overwhelming force. To prepare for that possibility, the United States created a new organization, Strategic Air Command. SAC's mission was stark and uncompromising. It needed air combat units capable of flying enormous distances, remaining airborne for long periods, and delivering the most advanced weapons ever devised. The men who formed its early ranks were veterans of World War II, many drawn from B-29 units, already familiar with the weight of strategic bombing. What SAC lacked, however, was an aircraft equal to its mission. Existing bombers could not meet the emerging requirements of speed, range, and payload demanded by the nuclear age. American planners needed a machine that could reach deep into enemy territory, survive hostile defenses, and return or press on under the most extreme conditions imaginable. It was within this context that Boeing began exploring radical new bomber designs. Engineers experimented with swept wings, jet propulsion, and configurations that challenged every assumption of previous aircraft. Yet progress remained uncertain until a pivotal meeting on the 21st of October 1948. At Wright Air Development Center, Colonel Henry Pete Worden confronted Boeing's engineers with a blunt demand. He was uninterested in paperwork and theoretical studies. What he wanted was a prototype, a jet-powered bomber, and he wanted it immediately. Worden gave them just 2 days. Faced with an almost impossible deadline, the Boeing team retreated not to a laboratory, but to a modest hotel room in Dayton, Ohio. Around a table littered with notes and calculations, performance data from earlier aircraft was reshaped into something larger, heavier, and far more ambitious. While some engineers worked through range and payload requirements, others carved a wooden model from balsa, giving physical form to an idea still racing against the clock. By the end of that weekend, the foundations of a new bomber had been laid. It would carry 8 jet engines, mounted in paired pods. It would span wider than any bomber before it, and it would be built for a world where hesitation could mean extinction. The age of the B-52 was about to begin. When the B-52 finally took shape, it did not resemble any bomber the world had seen before. Its swept wings stretched wide, its 8 jet engines hung in paired pods, and its sheer size challenged long-held assumptions about what an aircraft could do. On the 15th of April, 1951, The prototype designated the B-52 was rolled out for its first flight. For the engineers who had lived with the design for years, the moment was both triumphant and unnerving. Theory was about to meet gravity. The maiden flight confirmed what wind tunnels and calculations had promised. The aircraft flew. It was not perfect. Control forces were heavier than expected, and systems required refinement, but it was stable, powerful, and capable of sustained flight at ranges unmatched by any bomber in existence. Over the next several years, Boeing and the U.S. Air Force pushed the aircraft through relentless testing, redesigning systems, refining aerodynamics, and hardening it for the mission it was meant to perform. By the mid-1950s, the B-52 entered active service just as the Cold War reached a critical phase. The Soviet Union now possessed both atomic and hydrogen weapons, and American military planners believed that deterrence, not diplomacy alone, would prevent catastrophe. At the center of that deterrent stood Strategic Air Command. Under the leadership of General Curtis LeMay, SAC became an institution defined by discipline, precision, and unforgiving standards. LeMay understood that the bomber force could not afford uncertainty. Crews were trained relentlessly. Procedures were standardized, and even cockpit layouts were redesigned to improve coordination and decision-making under pressure. The B-52, once an experimental concept, was transformed into a tool of national survival. Life aboard the aircraft reflected that seriousness. Early B-52 crews numbered 6 men, each responsible for a narrow but vital function. Pilots and co-pilots managed the massive aircraft from the upper deck, while navigators and bombardiers worked below, eyes fixed on radar scopes and instruments. In the tail, a gunner watched the skies behind them. Fuel tanks filled nearly every available space, enabling flights that could last more than 20 hours. As Cold War doctrine evolved, so did the missions. The greatest fear was a sudden, preemptive Soviet strike. To counter that threat, Strategic Air Command maintained bombers at an extraordinary state of readiness. Crews lived on alert, sometimes for weeks at a time, prepared to launch within 15 minutes of an alarm. Some B-52 seconds were kept airborne continuously, fully armed, ensuring that retaliation would be possible even if American bases were destroyed. This constant vigilance demanded immense physical and psychological endurance. Refueling operations took place at night, in turbulent air, with aircraft separated by only a few feet. Missions were flown at extreme altitudes, where temperatures dropped far below zero and fatigue accumulated hour by hour. Yet the expectation never changed. Every crew was required to be ready, every day, to carry out orders that could alter human history. At its peak, the B-52 was not merely a bomber. It was the visible edge of American deterrence, a machine designed not to be used, yet always prepared to be unleashed. And as the world balanced uneasily between peace and annihilation, that paradox defined the aircraft's most critical role. As the Cold War intensified, the greatest danger was not open conflict, but miscalculation. Military planners feared a sudden Soviet first strike, one that could cripple American bases before bombers ever left the ground. To counter that possibility, Strategic Air Command embraced a radical solution: constant readiness in the air. Under Operation Chrome Dome, B-52 seconds, armed with thermonuclear weapons, patrolled the skies around the clock. Day and night, bombers followed predetermined routes across the Arctic, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, never more than a few hours from their assigned targets. If war came, retaliation would be immediate. If it did not, the aircraft would simply return home unseen, guardians of a fragile peace. The burden on the crews was immense. Some missions lasted more than 26 hours. At high altitude, temperatures plunged to -55 degrees. The air was dry, the cabin cramped, and fatigue constant. Refueling added another layer of danger. Tankers and bombers flew within feet of one another, connected by a single boom, where a moment of turbulence could prove fatal. Yet these risks were accepted as part of the mission. Deterrence demanded permanence. Behind the scenes, the decision to use nuclear weapons followed rigid procedures. A B-52 crew could not act on rumor or assumption. Orders arrived as coded messages, requiring verification by multiple crew members. Once authenticated, the aircraft was committed. There was no recall, no pause for reconsideration. The responsibility rested heavily on the men who carried it. That system, designed to prevent mistakes, was tested by accidents rather than enemy action. On the 17th of January 1966, a B-52 collided with a KC-135 tanker during refueling off the coast of Spain. The tanker crew was lost, and nuclear weapons from the bomber fell into the sea. Though safety mechanisms prevented detonation, the incident shocked the world. A similar accident later occurred near Greenland, reinforcing international fears that deterrence itself carried unacceptable risks. Neutral governments objected to nuclear-armed bombers flying over their territory. Public concern grew. At the same time, new technologies were changing the strategic balance. Intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines now offered alternative means of retaliation, ones less vulnerable to mid-air catastrophe. In response, American civilian and military leaders reassessed the policy. In September 1968, the continuous airborne alert mission of Chrome Dome was terminated. The era of nuclear-armed bombers circling the globe had come to an end. For the crews who had lived under that strain, the decision was bittersweet. They believed their vigilance had helped prevent war, yet they understood how close the system had come to disaster. The B-52 had fulfilled its role as a deterrent, but the shadow it cast was undeniable. Still, the aircraft's story was far from over. Freed from its constant nuclear patrols, the B-52 was about to be asked to do what it had never done before: fight a prolonged, conventional war against a determined enemy. From the American perspective, the B-52 represented more than military capability. It embodied a philosophy that defined the Cold War: deterrence. The logic was stark. Peace could be preserved not by goodwill alone, but by the certainty that any attack would be met with overwhelming retaliation. The bomber force, with the B-52 at its core, was designed to make that certainty undeniable. Within the United States, Strategic Air Command became the physical expression of that idea. Every procedure, every checklist, every alert drill was built around one assumption: that credibility was everything. If an adversary ever doubted America's ability or willingness to respond, deterrence would collapse. In that sense, the B-52 was never meant to be used. Its true mission was to exist, to fly, and to remain ready. Yet from the outside, the picture looked far more unsettling. To allies and neutral nations alike, fleets of nuclear-armed bombers crossing international airspace symbolized not stability, but risk. Accidents over Spain and Greenland made clear that even the most disciplined systems were vulnerable to human error and mechanical failure. For much of the world, the question was no longer whether deterrence worked, but how close it brought humanity to catastrophe. These concerns forced a strategic reckoning. As missile technology advanced, the United States no longer relied solely on manned bombers for retaliation. Intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched weapons offered constant readiness without visible presence in foreign skies. This shift eased diplomatic tensions and reduced the chance that a single accident could trigger a global crisis. Still, American leaders did not abandon the B-52. Instead, they redefined its role. Freed from the burden of continuous nuclear patrols, the aircraft became a flexible instrument of power, capable of delivering massive conventional firepower or precision-guided weapons anywhere on the globe. This adaptability allowed the United States to project force without immediately invoking the specter of nuclear war. For the men who flew the aircraft, the meaning of their service remained deeply personal. They understood that history might never record a single moment when deterrence succeeded because success meant nothing happened. Cities were not destroyed. Orders were not given. The silence endured. From Washington to Moscow, from Allied capitals to neutral governments, the B-52 shaped decisions, not through action, but through presence. It was a reminder that the balance of peace rested not on optimism, but on restraint, discipline, and the constant awareness of what failure would cost. The B-52 did not fade into history when the Cold War ended. Instead, it adapted. In Southeast Asia, it shed its role as a silent nuclear sentinel and became a blunt instrument of conventional war. During Operation Rolling Thunder, and later Operation Linebacker II, its bomb bays were filled not with weapons of last resort, but with thousands of tons of iron bombs. Over Hanoi, the aircraft faced surface-to-air missiles, electronic warfare, and losses it had never known before. Crews were shot down, captured, or killed. Victory, when it came, carried a heavy human cost. Yet even in that crucible, the B-52 proved its resilience. It absorbed damage, brought crews home, and delivered sustained firepower that few other platforms could match. When the Vietnam War ended, the aircraft endured, once more updated, modified, and reimagined for a changing world. Decades later, after the attacks of the 11th of September 2001, the B-52 was called upon again. This time, it flew with precision-guided weapons, supporting troops on the ground within minutes. The same aircraft once designed to deliver nuclear devastation now protected small units in remote valleys, striking targets with accuracy measured in meters rather than miles. Few machines in military history have undergone such a transformation. What explains this longevity is not nostalgia, but design. The B-52 was built with margin structural strength, payload capacity, and adaptability that allowed it to evolve as warfare itself changed. From the early years of jet propulsion to the age of satellite-guided munitions, it remained relevant because it could be reshaped without losing its core purpose. Projected to remain in service well into the 2040s, the B-52 will approach a century of active duty. No other bomber comes close to that record, but its true legacy cannot be measured in years alone. It lies in the men who sat alert through sleepless nights, waiting for orders that never came. It lies in the restraint shown by leaders who understood what those orders would unleash. And it lies in a paradox that defined an entire era, that the most powerful bomber ever built helped preserve peace precisely because it was ready for war. The engines may one day fall silent, the runways will empty, but the lesson will remain. What do you believe the B-52 ultimately represents? Deterrence that saved lives, or a reminder of how close humanity came to losing everything? Share your thoughts below. And if you value stories that explore the hard lessons of military history, consider joining us for the next chapter. The B-52 did not fade into history when the Cold War ended. Instead, it adapted. In Southeast Asia, it shed its role as a silent nuclear sentinel and became a blunt instrument of conventional war. During Operation Rolling Thunder and later Operation Linebacker II, its bomb bays were filled not with weapons of last resort, but with thousands of tons of iron bombs. Over Hanoi, the aircraft faced surface-to-air missiles, electronic warfare, and losses it had never known before. Crews were shot down, captured, or killed. Victory, when it came, carried a heavy human cost. Yet, even in that crucible, the B-52 proved its resilience. It absorbed damage, brought crews home, and delivered sustained firepower that few other platforms could match. When the Vietnam War ended, the aircraft endured once more, updated, modified, and reimagined for a changing world. Decades later, after the attacks of the 11th of September 2001, the B-52 was called upon again. This time, it flew with precision-guided weapons, supporting troops on the ground within minutes. The same aircraft once designed to deliver nuclear devastation now protected small units in remote valleys, striking targets with accuracy measured in meters rather than miles. Few machines in military history have undergone such a transformation. What explains this longevity is not nostalgia, but design. The B-52 was built with margin structural strength, payload capacity, and adaptability that allowed it to evolve as warfare itself changed. From the early years of jet propulsion to the age of satellite-guided munitions, it remained relevant because it could be reshaped without losing its core purpose. Projected to remain in service well into the 2040s, the B-52 will approach a century of active duty. No other bomber comes close to that record, but its true legacy cannot be measured in years alone. It lies in the men who sat alert through sleepless nights, waiting for orders that never came. It lies in the restraint shown by leaders who understood what those orders would unleash. And it lies in a paradox that defined an entire era, that the most powerful bomber ever built helped preserve peace precisely because it was ready for war. The engines may one day fall silent. The runways will empty. But the lesson will remain. What do you believe the B-52 ultimately represents? Deterrence that saved lives, or a reminder of how close humanity came to losing everything? Share your thoughts below. And if you value stories that explore the hard lessons of military history, consider joining us for the next chapter.